Following Bayern Munich's Champions League semi-final loss to PSG, Vincent Kompany stood behind the microphone and said something you hardly ever hear him say. The officials, who, in his words, tipped the tie to the wrong side, were the target of direct, sharp, and unadulterated frustration. There were 2 handball incidents, a red card that was never issued, and a 6-5 aggregate result that could have been quite different. Had the referee saw what the 70,000 spectators in the Allianz Arena witnessed? Let's examine what transpired at the Allianz Arena on May 6, 2026, and why, following the final whistle, Vincent Kompany, his players, and even the CEO of Bayern Munich came out fighting. The night was meant to represent Bayern Munich's return to their European identity. One of the most dreaded venues in Champions League history, the Allianz Arena, was full. After one of the best first legs of a Champions League semi-final ever, the 6-time European champions lost 5-4 on aggregate. Paris scored 9 goals. With 2 goals from Kvicha Kvaratskhelia, 2 from Ousmane Dembele, a penalty kick from Harry Kane, an equalizer from Michael Ollis, and a late strike from Luis Diaz, Bayern returned home with just 1 goal needed to tie the score. One objective is turn the tie's entire momentum back in their favor. Instead, the second leg will be remembered for the referee's actions and inactions rather than the goals. In the second minute of the game, Ousmane Dembele scored. Kvicha Kvaratskhelia put Dembele in the ideal position to hammer the ball home after cutting back and blazing past his marker down the left flank. For 2 minutes. PSG only needed that. The Allianz Arena fell silent in shock as the aggregate now stood at 6-4. There was cause for optimism because Bayern had defeated Real Madrid in the quarterfinals after conceding after just 36 seconds. However, things were different this time. What transpired in the minutes that followed would force Vincent Kompany to reach a level no one had previously witnessed. Something happened in the 29th minute that would go on to become the tie's central dispute. Already receiving a yellow card, Nuno Mendes stopped a Bayern counterattack with an obvious handball. Under normal conditions, it would have resulted in a second yellow card, a red card, and a penalty, or at the very least, a free kick in a dangerous area, because it was obvious and appeared intentional. The ball obviously impacted the PSG left-back's outstretched arm. However, João Pinheiro, the Portuguese referee, did not issue a second yellow. Mendes was not dismissed by him. Rather, he called out Conrad Lima's handball. 5 seconds after the Mendes incident, the Bayern player who had flicked the ball on caused the entire Bayern bench to explode. The Allianz Arena erupted in shock. 3 minutes later, it happened once more while Kompany stood on the touchline, clearly shaking his head. Vitinha attempted to clear the ball in the 32nd minute, but João Neves, a teammate, blocked it inside the area. Neves' arm was extended far above his head when the ball impacted it. Bayern's players called for a penalty right away. Running toward the referee, Joshua Kimmich and Josip Stanisic made wild gestures, pointing to the spot where the ball had hit Neves' hand. It was evident in the replay. The ball struck the raised arm. It seemed like the kind of situation that ought to have prompted the video assistant referee to step in during a Champions League semi-final where the tie was at stake. However, Portuguese referee João Pinheiro made no calls, which infuriated the Bayern players. Play went on without a penalty or VAR overturn. The handball rules of the International Football Association Board were the source of the technicality that was later mentioned. It is not considered handball if a player is struck on the hand or arm by a teammate's shot or header unless the ball enters the other team's goal or the player scores as a result of that contact. The regulation theoretically protected navies because Marquinhos, a PSG teammate, gave the clearance. However, the issue was more intricate than that. The arm was lifted rather than in its natural posture. The inconsistency was the source of the frustration. Because Alphonso Davies had given up a penalty for handball during the first match back in Paris. VAR overruled the referee's decision. Davies was also ignorant about it. PSG, however, received their spot kick. Dembele changed his mind. And the first leg's momentum was changed by that punishment. Thus, it was a straightforward question that hovered in the air at the Allianz Arena. How are 2 different handball instances by PSG players, one of which ought to have resulted in a second yellow and a red card, if Davies' handball was sufficient for a penalty in Paris? Not enough in Munich for anything. Bayern Munich was shocked that PSG wasn't called for a handball on either of these plays. ESPN FC brought attention to the controversy right away, pointing out that Nuno Mendes would have received a second yellow in the initial incident. The remainder of the game took place against this backdrop. PSG didn't have to score once more. They had the lead overall, their early goal, and, in Bayern's opinion, the protection of the referee. In the second half, Luis Enrique's team displayed a more composed side to their play, absorbing Bayern's pressure while maintaining their own counterattack danger. Manuel Neuer stopped Desiré Doué and Kvaratskhelia. The Bavarians persisted in their efforts, but they were unsuccessful. Until Kane scored in stoppage time for the 7th consecutive Champions League game, Bayern was unable to overcome their dominance of possession and territory. However, it was already too late. The game ended in a 1-1 draw. PSG, 6-5 overall. Officially, FC Bayern was eliminated from the 2025-2026 Champions League. The camera caught Kompany as soon as the last whistle blew. The football world was shocked by what Vincent Kompany stated during his post-match press conference. This was not the typical cool-headed diplomatic post-match response. This manager, who had just witnessed his team's elimination from the Champions League semi-final, thought the refereeing had made a significant contribution, and he made the decision that he would not allow it to go unnoticed. He began with deference. Obviously, it's difficult to endure. We barely lost. PSG was matched by us. Little details determined the outcome of these games. He applauded his players' enthusiasm, acknowledged PSG's quality, and said all the things you would expect a coach to say following a semi-final loss. The tone changed after that. It's my responsibility to evaluate what Bayern Munich can do better, but I'm not sure why it's not a red card. Why do we not get a penalty here, and why do we give up one in Paris? He was talking specifically about the João Neves handball and the Nuno Mendes incident, two incidents that, in his opinion, ought to have completely altered the outcome of the game. He went into detail about the Neves incident, saying, "I know the rules, and the ball came from his own player, but come on from 10 meters with your hand above your head." Kompany was highlighting the ridiculousness of concealing the arm's obviously abnormal position behind a technicality. Kompany discussed the psychological impact of the loss and the additional annoyance of believing that other influences had made a difference. At least if you lose, it's your own fault, so it's what it is when the games are so close and people are exerting so much effort to reach that objective. To put it another way, if his team was simply outplayed, he could accept losing. He was unable to accept losing due to illogical decisions. Then came the line that summed up the entire news conference in one sentence. However, it seemed as though someone was constantly tilting it against us. Take nothing away from PSG's caliber. He wasn't finished. Nothing worked out for us. When you examine the contentious times, they consistently worked against us. Tonight, I witnessed a penalty and a red card, but the referee didn't. Clear, direct and unambiguous. The quotes were quickly picked up by Fabrizio Romano. I think Nuno Mendes should have been sent off, but congratulations to PSG. And then in a statement that seemed to be aimed at UEFA itself. I'm hoping that some of these officiating choices will work in our favor the following season. There was a hint of bitterness in that final line. It was the kind of remark that usually results in a UEFA charge or sanction for managers. However, Kompany was unconcerned at the time. He thought the officiating had been a decisive element in his team's elimination. It was more than just companionship. Bayern Munich's players repeated their managers' annoyance throughout the mixed zone and in post-match interviews, adding more and more details to what was quickly turning into one of the most controversial refereeing disputes in recent Champions League history. The person directly involved in the Nuno Mendes handball incident, Conrad Lima, was blunt by nature. I believed that Mendes had used his hand to play the ball after I had used my stomach. 5 seconds later, the referee blew the whistle for handball against me. That's quite odd. Lima's story was powerful. In his opinion, the referee had not only overlooked Mendes' handball but had also fined him for a less obvious offense. The reporter then revealed that the fourth official, not the main referee, had actually made the handball call against Lima. Lemmer's reaction was deteriorating. The fourth official has been interfering in the game since when? That is something I have never encountered before. A player at the top of the game made the astounding revelation that something had happened during a Champions League semi-final that he had never witnessed in his professional life. Lamar continued by recognizing the extent of what had been lost. If PSG had lost a player so early, it would have been a pivotal moment, and he was correct. PSG would have played the final 60-plus minutes of a Champions League semifinal with 10 men if Nuno Mendes had been sent off in the 29th minute after receiving his second yellow card. The tone of the game would have drastically shifted at the Allianz Arena against a Bayern Munich team that was already desperate, pushing, and creating opportunities. Captain Manuel Neuer, who has spent over 20 years at the top of European football, addressed the sense of discontent without disguising his dissatisfaction with the team's own performance. Tonight, we lacked the killer instinct. It would have been a different story if we had scored the goal during a crucial moment. Neuer recognized both sides of the issue in his remarks. Although Bayern had let themselves down in front of goal, the referee's displeasure were legitimate. The criticism then spread even further up the Bayern Munich organization, past the players and the manager. Referee João Pinheiro was directly attacked by CEO Jan-Christian Driesen. The fact that a referee with just 15 Champions League appearances is permitted to officiate such a match is, to put it mildly, astounding, and it may account for some of the calls he made today. The CEO of a club openly challenges UEFA's selection of a referee for a Champions League semi-final. That is a remarkable step. It showed how severely the entire Bayern Munich organization was frustrated. Manuel Greff, a former German referee, publicly questioned the João Neves handball incident from the dressing room to the boardroom. Graf made a strong case that, regardless of the technicalities, the incident should have resulted in a punishment. Comparing this to the Marc Cucurella handball scandal from a prior competition, UEFA eventually admitted the mistake months later. In line with Graf's opinion, many on social media were furious about the play and did believe it was a penalty. The Bayern bubble was not the only place where the dispute existed. The same doubts were being raised by pundits, neutral observers, and former referees around Europe. Even though Bayern Munich would rather concentrate on the official, there is another narrative here that they cannot overlook if they take a brief break from the refereeing debate.